So, I'm making this quick video because I think it's important for me to document my failures just as much as my successes. And if you're anything like me, fishing these days is less about catching the fish. It's more about the quest for knowledge, the quest for understanding, and just figuring the fish out. And honestly, it's trips like these where I don't catch a lot of fish that I think I learn the most. And my hopes are by watching this video, you guys learn something too. So let's get right into it. This is a story about my trip to the Cayman Islands. Here was the goal. I wanted to catch a bonefish. I wanted to do it on the fly, and I did not want to use a guide. This was going to be all DIY. I prepared for weeks in advance. I read a book called DIY Bone Fishing. I read every article online. I scoured Google Maps looking for the best spots. I felt prepared. But one quick disclaimer, this was actually my wife and I's baby moon. She was nice enough to let me fish. And for this reason, certain elements of this trip were outside of my control, which we will get into. So, day number one, we got in around 11 o'clock, checked into our hotel on 7 Mile Beach, had a few hours to kill, so we headed out to Barker's National Park. I had the spot circled on the map. It seemed like the best fishing spot, and it was only like 15 minutes from our hotel. So I decided to make a quick scouting trip to Barker's. I just wanted to find a spot for me to start the next day. Barker's turned out to be completely wild. It was basically just a maze of gravel roads bordered by deep canals and thick mangrove swamps. It took me about 30 minutes to find my way to the fishing spot because half of these gravel roads were actually underwater just due to flooding. But I eventually found my way to the point where I wanted to fish, where the flats seemed the biggest. And I was amazed when I first pulled up on these flats. They seemed perfect. They were wadeable, accessible, and there was plenty of sandy bottom so I could see the fish. Now, there definitely was grass, as you can see here as well, but it seemed like a good enough spot, and I gave it a shot. So after about an hour of stalking the flats, I finally saw my first pack of bonefish, and to be honest, I was surprised at how easy they were to see. They approached me from my right, I made a quick cast, a couple little strips, and bang, I almost hooked into one. Unfortunately, I have the freshwater hook set programmed into my mind, so I did not strip set, lost this fish, but honestly, it was kind of a confidence builder. I was surprised that I was able to find bonefish and get one to hit my fly within the first hour. I hung out there for about 30 minutes after hooking that fish. Didn't see anything, decided to head back. Day number two. So day number two was supposed to be my big fishing day. We had no plans. I was going to fish the entire day. My one big concern with Barker's was that the wind was pounding the point I was fishing. So, in an attempt to find a less windy spot that would make it easier to find bonefish, I drove about 30-40 minutes to the southeast part of the island and fished Frank Sound. Despite what my windy app said, the wind was supposed to be out of the northeast. When I got to Frank Sound, I found that it was actually windier than Barker's National Park. As you can see here, it was pretty choppy and it made it really hard to see any fish. So I waited around for about an hour, didn't see anything, found this cool platform here, which was definitely made by other people fly fishing for bonefish. But eventually just got sick of the spot, decided to go make a little change that I kind of regret. I looked at my map, saw that the only spot on the island that would have truly been out of the wind if it was coming out of the east was going to be Rum Point, which was about a 30-minute drive around the island. Since there are not a lot of roads on the island, I would have had to backtrack if this spot didn't work out. So when I got there, it looked perfect at first sight. There was no wind, glassy flats, a lot of sand. Unfortunately, there were a ton of people in boats and even jet skis buzzing around, as you can see here. And this is when I first started to realize that this was a small island with a lot of people. So I decided to turn around, make the hour trek back to the hotel. I did stop at one flat by Frank Sound on the way back that was more out of the wind. Stalked it for about an hour, didn't see anything. Continued the journey home. So as I was eating lunch, I was just thinking about how I did not see a single fish for 2 to 3 hours that morning. I had to be doing something wrong. I thought back to what I had read. One thing that DIY bone fishing said was the most important factor is fishing the rising tide. And that morning, I had been fishing a high falling tide. In the evening before, I was fishing a rising tide where I saw those bonefish. So I came to the conclusion that these fish were definitely tide dependent. And unfortunately, that's when I started to realize that I had timed this trip pretty poorly. You see, I was used to fishing the Northeast and Florida and North Carolina where there are two tide cycles a day. But in the Cayman Islands, and I guess most of the Caribbean, there's only one tide cycle. So there could be a chance where a rising tide is only happening after dark, which was the case here. So looking at the tide charts, I quickly realized that I only had about 2 to 3 hours left of daytime rising tide in my entire trip. So tired and exhausted, I decided that I had to make a trip out to Barker's that evening again to fish the rising tide. So I got out there right as the tide was starting to rise, stalked the flats for about 2 hours, went back to shore, sat on a branch, took a little break. Some wild chickens scared me half to death, and then this happened.
All right, man, we got tailing bonefish right in front of us here. Right in front of us. Was just sitting on a branch. You got tailing bonefish right here, man. Come on, take it.
So this exact scene goes on for another 30 minutes. Eventually, I had to make a change. I decided to switch to a crab pattern. These fish were just digging their noses in this deep seaweed that was floating in the shallows, and I had seen crabs scurrying out of it, so I thought a crab might be a good switch. Made a few casts with the crab, rejected. My mind was racing at this point. I had tailing bonefish not even 10 yards from me. They weren't going anywhere, they weren't getting spooked, but it didn't seem like I had the fly to catch these fish. I started thinking about what I had read. A big thing that all the books and the websites said was that your fly has to be the same color as the bottom. And these fish were digging their noses in this deep red, green kind of seaweed. And I didn't have any flies that matched that color. So I remembered one of the books recommending using kind of an alternative color, something that contrasted the bottom. So I tied on this pink shrimp, made a few casts, rejected. By that point, it was getting super dark. I had to call it and head back. Day number 3. Morale was quite low at this point.
Got to admit, morale is low.
Desperation had ensued. I had to do something after having my flies rejected 3 times. I was really concerned that I did not have the right fly to catch these tailing bonefish in the shallows, and I was running out of hours of a rising tide. So after our lovely boat trip that morning, which honestly, in hindsight, might have been the highlight of the trip, I went to the grocery store and bought some fresh shrimp. And I headed out to Barker's National Park that evening to fish the 1 hour of rising tide that I had left on my entire trip. You bet I found those tailing bonefish in the same exact spots, made a few casts with a hunk of shrimp, and lo and behold, they turned it down. Now, I had actually caught fish like this growing up in the Bahamas, so I was confident that this was a method that would work. And thinking back on this now, I truly have no idea why these fish did not take this shrimp. Only thought would be that they were not looking for shrimp in these weeds, they were looking for crabs or something else. So it had gotten dark, I had dinner plans, I had to head back. Day number 4. By this point, morale was at an all-time low. Every single day, we have found the fish, we have targeted the fish, and they have turned away what we have thrown at them. It has been demoralizing. So at the hottest point of the day, when the tide was dead low, I decided to make a trip out to the cliffs on the west side of the West Bay. At this point, I was willing to settle for anything. I just wanted to catch a fish. It could have been a snapper, it could have been a jack, literally anything. I just wanted to feel a fish on the end of my line. And I figured these cliffs were by deep water. Deep water meant bigger fish, so I gave it a shot. So this spot actually turned out to be pretty cool. As you can see here, there were limestone deposits. I was finding these all over the island. It was basically like sharp, dark coral. So it was a cool spot. Unfortunately, there were not a lot of fish here. I made probably 10 casts with cut shrimp. These fish were super, super, super smart. Picked the shrimp right off every time they hit the water. Some schooling jacks ended up rolling through. I took a few casts with my fly rod, ended up tangling it horribly. Got really, really frustrated and hot. Realized I was on vacation, decided to call it quits and head back to the hotel and start drinking early. Day number 5, the final day of our Cayman Islands trip. In hindsight, I'm honestly surprised that I even fished this day. As I contemplated my options the night before, the only thing I could think of was to fish the morning. That's the only thing I hadn't done, and fishing the morning would mean that I would actually have some water on the flats. It would be a high falling tide. So we decided to do it. We set the alarm early. We decided to fish Barkers. That was the only place I had seen fish the entire trip. We got out there at the crack of dawn. Decided to start with a little topwater spook. We weren't really going to target bonefish. Our plan was to target some smaller tarpon, maybe some snook. We wanted to wade south here along these mangroves where the water started to drop off as the flats ended. Unfortunately, the fishing gods had other plans for us. We started heading south, and just as we turned the corner, we realized that there was another fisherman sitting right in the spot we wanted to fish. This was the first fisherman I had seen at Barker's all week, so it was a little bit of a shock and pretty disappointing. But we worked the mangroves that we could. We blind casted the flats with our topwater a bit, but after about 30 minutes, we decided to head back and make a little change. So we made a switch to this twitch bait. It was one of 2 lures I had left, and we just started blind casting the flats since the drop off was taken. At this point, we were really only targeting jacks, maybe some barracuda, maybe some smaller tarpon if they were on the flats. Who knows? Within the first 5 minutes, we actually got a hit.
Oh my God. Oh, folks. The first hit of the trip. Oh my God. There's fish here. God, something took that and ran.
And it seemed like a bigger fish, so confidence was up. I kept working it, and eventually I actually hooked into a nice fish. Of course, this is when my GoPro battery died, and so I missed the strike in the first couple minutes of the fight. But I did get it back on at the end and got this. This ended up being my PB Barracuda. So we got it to shore, got a great video of it here, as you can see, and released it. So at this point, I was honestly just glad to have the monkey off my back after 4 days of not catching any fish. This felt really, really good. So after the release, we headed back down south. I honestly didn't care about this person being there at this point. I just wanted to catch a bigger fish, and we were running out of time. So I was just blind casting these flats, and we actually hooked into a big fish.
Oh my God. There we go. Oh my gosh. Oh my God, we got a runner. Oh man, that thing took off. Oh my God, I think we got a tarpon. Holy smokes, guys, we got a tarpon. Holy smokes. Holy shit, he hammered that thing. This might be a bigger barracuda, guys. Woo, just shook it right next to me.
And then about 2 minutes later, we had another barracuda go for our bait and slice our leader, which was very on brand for the trip. And at that point, we surrendered to the fishing gods and called it a trip. So, what did we learn? I think first and foremost, tides are so important, especially when you're fishing down here and only have one tide cycle. If you're planning a trip to the Cayman Islands or anywhere in the Caribbean, you got to plan it around the tides. And if you're not able to plan it around the tides, look at the tides before you go down and figure out when you're going to load up your fishing so that you're fishing the right tide. The second big takeaway for me is just to bring more flies. As you saw on that second day, I did not have flies that matched the bottom of where those fish were feeding. And whether I was fishing Barkers or Frank Sound, there was definitely a lot of sand, but there was also a lot of grass. As you can see here, there was a lot of grassy bottom. So looking back, I definitely should have brought in more flies. I definitely should have brought in some darker flies. And last but not least, hindsight is always 2020. If I could do it all again, I would have gotten a guide. At least for a half day on the first or second day. And I just would have loved to pick his brain. Just get me started in the right direction. Make sure I'm fishing the right spots. Make sure I'm using the right flies. I just think this would have made the trip so much more enjoyable. So that's all I got for you guys today. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. Leave a comment, leave a like, make fun of me, do whatever you want. We'll be back shortly, hopefully, with some better videos with me catching some more fish. We're going to be fishing some more familiar water up in Cape Cod in the next few months. So a lot more awesome fishing videos to come. See you guys next time.